So first I'd like to welcome you here and Scott Westerfeld here. Scott is the author of 18 or so novels and various peripheral books related to various series. As one does, I went to Wikipedia a couple of days ago to look up to see what it actually says about Scott, and the first sentence is that Scott Westerfeld is an American author of science fiction, and it occurred to me that there are two important details in there that need to be kind of qualified.
They need citation.
That's right. And you can tell from Scott's distinctive Sydney accent that he spends a lot of time in Australia, and he doesn't only just write science fiction, but we'll talk about both. I thought we'd kick off by talking about possibly Scott's best-known series, which is the Uglies books. Who here has read the Uglies novels?
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a novel, for those who haven't read the series, it's a novel set in a world where children have plastic surgery at 16 and it's mandatory. They're made beautiful. They go from being uglies to beautiful people. And it's kind of would you call it a dystopian novel? Or?
Well, it's an ambiguous utopia that eventually gets found out. I got the idea in a kind of weird way. A friend of mine, I spent most of my life in New York as an adult. And a friend of mine about 15 years ago was moving from New York to LA, and he really didn't want to go because he'd always been a New Yorker. He had lived in Manhattan for many years, and of course there's a kind of rivalry between New York and Los Angeles because, you know, we have dump trucks and muggers, and they have movie stars and palm trees, and, you know, I don't even know why they try, but but there was this kind of rivalry, and we were all teasing him about having to go live in LA, and his way of dealing with this change was to write these sort of anthropological memos back to us, like these long emails back to his friends in New York about the strange ways of the Los Angelinos. And one of the first one was about going to the dentist. Like the first time he went to the dentist in LA, at first it was normal. Like he would, you know, you swish, you spit, you have pictures taken of your teeth. It was all very normal. But at the end, the dentist said to him kind of softly and quietly in his ear, you know, Mr. Sams, I think I need to see you in my office afterward. And he was like, oh crap, I have mouth cancer or something. So he goes back to the office, and there's all of her credentials on the wall, and she folds her hands sitting behind her desk and says, Mr. Sams, I have a serious question for you. Where do you want your teeth to be in 5 years? And he said, in my mouth? She said, well, yes, very, very amusing, but seriously, I think we need a 5-year plan for your teeth. And he was like, I don't have a 5-year plan for any of my body parts. I don't actually know what you mean. And they had this long sort of uncomfortable conversation. And what he realized finally is that, you know, here were his regular sort of New Yorker teeth, like coffee drinking, hard living New Yorker teeth. And over here are like Tom Cruise's teeth. You know when Tom Cruise smiles and it's just a blank of white spotlights shining at you? And she was saying, you know, how much money do you want to spend? How much time in my chair? How much pain are you willing to go through to get what percentage of the way from you to Tom Cruise? And he sort of said some non-committal things and wandered out into the blinding Los Angeles sunlight thinking, that was just weird, I must have picked a crazy dentist. But then as he walked around that day, he started to see people who were clearly on the 5-year plan. And they weren't movie stars. They were like, you know, the person checking out his groceries or the crossing guard. They would just have these movie star teeth. And he wrote us this email, us New Yorker friends of his, and I started thinking about how weird it would be to live in that world, and to be in a world in which you are constantly aware of how you looked, and you were on a sort of a 5-year plan. So I decided it would be cool to write a book set in a world in which everybody becomes beautiful when they turn 16, and where every friendship gets divided into, you know, if your friend is a few months older than you, then they graduate off to beauty and you're still stuck being an ugly. And I started thinking of all the dynamics that would happen in that world.
And it's a world that's not so different from ours. It's the mandatory nature of the 16th birthday surgery option that makes it very different from ours. But we do live in a world where we are aware of the way we look and the options we have for changing the way we look, which kind of makes Uglies a very strong commentary on our own culture right now. Yeah. Did you intend that as you were writing it, or were you thinking this could be really serious stuff? Or were you just thinking, what a great adventure, you know, separate kids, make them beautiful?
Well, I mean,
in-app surgery.
Yeah, I mean, as Justine said a couple of sessions ago, those kinds of things are good for generating a plot. It's having specific moments when things happen. In real life, change tends to be continuous and gradual, but it's more fun in novels to make change more dramatic and all happening at once. This is the summer why I became a man, or whatever. And so I thought it would be fun to have a society that had more of a ritual, and it's on your 16th birthday that you become beautiful, and before then, teenagers are just called uglies before they're 16, and they're called pretties after 16. So
it's like that's a transition from teenagerhood to adulthood in an hour. It's
well, it takes a couple weeks, but it's a large operation. You get, if you're too short, you become taller. If you're too tall, you become shorter. It's the whole thing. I mean, it's interesting that one of the most successful places for the series has been South America, because in Venezuela and Brazil and places like that, there is such a premium on beauty, and there's a lot of people get plastic surgery at age 16 and even younger. And so there's so I mean, and we do all kinds of things to modify ourselves now. I mean, if you compare someone, I'm 49, if you met somebody 200 years ago who's 49, they'd look really different than I look now. The fact that I have all my teeth would be amazing 100 or 200 years ago. And so we are changing the way, our relationship to the way people look all the time. And you look at pictures of when I look at pictures of my dad when he was my age, it's like, whoa, he looks so much older, and he had so many more responsibilities, and I think there's lots of. It's a natural progression from our current society.
That's right, exactly. With the colour turned up slightly, which is one of the great things about science fiction and fantasy. You can pump our society into the meat blender and produce a sausage that kind of looks like meat, but is actually something very different, a whole different consumer experience. That's probably stretching that metaphor a little bit.
Yeah, let's just keep going with that metaphor throughout the rest of the session.
A couple of vegetarian non-sausage eaters sitting up here discussing sausages. The first book of Uglies you've adapted into manga called Shay's Story. Which is out and about and doing well, I hope. But it's not the first series, it's not the only series that has a visual component in your books. Your later series, the Leviathan books, has a strong visual element. Would you like to talk about that, how that came into being?
When about 2 years after Uglies came out, I got something in the mail which was the Japanese edition of Uglies. And first I was holding it backwards, of course, because I'm old and didn't grow up on manga. But then when I got it turned around the right way, I was like, oh, cool, it's the Japanese edition of Uglies. And I immediately opened it up and was crushed to discover that I cannot read Japanese. But it was still cool. Having written a book in Japanese was so neat. I started paging through the copy thinking, this is my book and it's in Japanese. And about 10 pages in, I ran into an illustration. And there was a picture of Tally and Shay on their hoverboards, and it was a scene from Uglies, and I recognized it immediately, even though I couldn't make head or tail of the kanji. And I was like, well, that's weird. And I went through the whole thing, and I found 12 illustrations. And I took pictures of them on my phone and put them on my blog, and said, hey, look, the Japanese edition of Uglies has illustrations. And there was outrage on the internet. Try to imagine that, angry people on the internet.
Inconceivable.
And it was just all these, American teenagers and Australian and English teenagers saying, they got pictures, we didn't get pictures. Where are the pictures? Why are there no pictures? And, and who better to think about cultural justice than a middle-class, first-world teenager, right? And I was like, that's a good question, though. Did they add the pictures because they thought certain things wouldn't be understandable? And this wise 12-year-old manga fan came on my blog and said, actually in Japan, almost all books are illustrated. If you're reading mystery, romance, science fiction, any genre book, for teenagers or for adults, they're called light novels, and they all have illustrations. And I said, that's a really interesting cultural difference, and that's a really interesting translation difference. The book becomes different when you add pictures to it. And then it occurred to me that 100 years ago, we did the same thing. If you were reading Jane Austen, if you were reading Sherlock Holmes stories or H.G. Wells, you would have had pictures in your books 100 years ago, even if you're an adult. Wasn't a kid-adult thing. And I was just curious about why that disappeared. And it turns out it had a lot to do with the camera. I just started researching it. And back in the old days, 100 years ago, if you opened up a newspaper, like 120 years ago, there would be, a picture of the cricket game. But it would be an illustration. Someone will have gone and drawn it.
Like sketch artists in courtroom today.
Yeah, exactly. And if 100 years ago, if your house burned down and you ran out into the street with just a blanket and you're sitting there watching, your house burning down, standing next to you would be a guy drawing your house burning down to appear in the newspaper the next day. And of course, that meant that all the advertising, all the catalogs, everything had illustrators. So there were these huge rooms full of people whose jobs were, it was called being a draftsman or an illustrator. So you had thousands of people in every city who could draw. And that made it really easy for the publishing industry, when they wanted to put out a book, to say, oh, let's just grab some of those guys and they can do the illustrations. But when the camera appeared, that all those people lost their jobs, basically. And that meant that it became more expensive and much more of a niche thing to illustrate. And that's when they started taking pictures out of books. So remember when you were like 8 years old and you got a book with no illustrations? And you were like, this sucks. Why are there no pictures? Did they tell you? Because, did your librarian tell you, oh, that's because the camera was invented? No, they give you some big line of bullshit about your imagination. They said something like, oh, big kids don't like illustrations. You don't want pictures in your books anymore. But that's totally a lie. So around the time I was sort of discovering all this, I was writing a book called Leviathan, which is set in 1914, right at the beginning of World War I. And I was reading lots of books, like teenage adventures from that era. And they all had pictures. They all had illustrations. Even though if they were for teenagers or for adults, every book was illustrated. And I was like, these are so cool. I think it would be really awesome to have a book, in the 21st century that has like 50 illustrations in it, even though it's a novel. Because you just don't see that anymore. Yeah,
as opposed to a graphic novel or something else. It's a novel with pictures. Did that change the way you wrote the story? Did you ever hit a point in the course of drafting a chapter where you thought, a picture could carry some of the weight here, or were the pictures add-ons to the text that was cool stuff that made the page kind of leap out a bit more?
Yeah, well, a lot of different things happened that I didn't expect. I was writing at the same time as my illustrator was drawing. So I would write a few chapters, and then I would send him the chapters. And Keith Thompson, as a great Canadian artist, would start sketching and working and send me back ideas and sketches. And at first I was ahead of him a ways, but then eventually he caught up. So at some point I just said to him, something's going to chase him in like 3 chapters, so draw something that looks kind of fast.
Cool.
And then I'll write it in. and so it's the sort of, those of you who read the book, the sort of horse scouts, they're like mechanical horses. Those were actually invented by Keith and not by me. And there was also times where he would draw something that I thought was only going to appear in 1 chapter, but then it was just so cool that I was like, well, that's just awesome, and it has to come back because I want to do more drawings of it. And it's sort of like when you're writing TV. There's, like Spike was only supposed to be in 3 episodes of Buffy, but everybody loves Spike, so he becomes a character on that and other televisions, So it was still a bit more interactive, and it was kind of like writing TV or a comic book where you get feedback from another medium that changes the way you write. And there was one other weird thing that happened, which was I realized, I sent him 5 chapters from book 3, which is this sort of big escape from the Leviathan. Alec and his men escape. And the sketches all came back, and I was like, Keith, the last 5 sketches have all been really dark. Like, they're kind of dark and muddy. And he was like, yeah, well, it's night. And I realized, oh yeah, that doesn't usually affect me. I'm a novelist.
Yeah.
I can write a whole book at night, and it's not dark. It's just, the page is just as white. And I realized that there were times when I'd already been doing this where I needed some sources of light to vary the way it looked. And sometimes I would like have a chapter where there's a crowded scene, and I say, well, the next chapter, let's just make it 2 people in a room, so that it's much more intimate. And so you started changing I started writing scenes to have, different numbers of people and to have long shots and short shots and light and dark, and to start to balance all these visual elements that normally you don't have to balance. And sometimes I would move my characters to a cool setting just to have a conversation they could have had in the same room they were in the last chapter, but then Keith gets to draw a cool setting.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like making a movie. I mean, I'm sure that, TV and movie people are going like, oh yeah, we know how to do that. That's a thing. That's a solved problem, but not by me.
Did you ever have the constraints that sometimes you have on TV where you can only afford 3 sets? So maybe you and Keith had only researched one particular aspect of kind of clanker technology and didn't have time or inclination to research another one, so you had to bring something back.
Well, that was his problem, not mine. So,
so he did the research on that.
He turned out very quickly. Somewhere in the first scene, Alec has a pistol when they first meet, and I said to him after I saw the pistol, I don't think that's the right pistol, because I said a Steiner pistol, and he was like, oh yes, you're thinking the 1914 Steiner pistol. This is the 1912, which was preferred by officers. And that was the last time I ever questioned any of his research. He might have been making it up. But.
Now you might have gathered from, if you haven't read the books, you might be gathering that this isn't quite your typical 1914. It's actually an alternate universe 1914. Right. Would you care to describe the differences between, or the vast differences between the main characters, Alex and Darren's world and our world?
Right.
100 years ago. It'll be 100 years ago next year.
Yes, it is. I should have waited to...
That's right.
I wanted to do a sort of a mad scientist. I've always thought it would be cool to do a sort of a mad scientist book and to think about, but I wanted my mad scientist to be a sort of a biologist. Because you get lots of mad scientists building machines or or using electricity, and I thought a biology would be cool. And then I thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool if like Charles Darwin was a mad scientist, and if Charles Darwin had discovered DNA, and had started creating creatures. So like his book Origins of Species would actually be a how-to manual. And he had discovered the life threads and started combining these creatures. And the British Empire had been built not on the backs of the steam engine, but on the backs of these sort of hybrid, strange, chimeric creatures. So they use, they have these message lizards that carry messages that are sort of like half parrot, half lizard. They have these war creatures like half lion, half tiger kind of things. And there's the Leviathan itself, which is, of course, based on the life threads of a whale. And it's basically like it's a hydrogen-filled whale that flies. And that Keith managed to make that idea look reasonable is kind of a testament to his abilities as an illustrator. So I wanted to like, so Darwin's not in the book, of course, because he's long dead, but he basically changed the way that science works in England and France and Russia on one side of the war. And on the other side of the war, they use machines more like we do.
Except they're more of a steampunky kind of
Except
world,
cooler machines that walk and stuff. So there's walking tanks and things like that. So basically World War I isn't just a collision between these two ideologies or between royal houses, but it's actually a collision between technologies, between metal and flesh. And in a way, that's what World War I was about. It was about, on the one hand, these ideas of valor and masculinity and bravery running up against machine guns. People thinking, if we're just brave enough, we can surely rush those machine guns. And,
right.
Of course, bravery turns out to be a bad thing when you're fighting against machine guns or tanks and you're a dude, on a horse. So it's sort of set in a much more fantastical 1914, which is another reason to do illustrations. So you can sort of show the world as well as talk about it.
But it's still very closely related to our world, and there are a lot of parallels. You meet a few famous characters throughout the course of the book. I won't spoil any of who they may be. And one of the main protagonists is actually a very important person from our history who didn't survive or didn't exist. Is that right?
Didn't exist. Yeah. There's a male and a female character, and it's sort of star-crossed lovers. So the male character is a clanker. He's Austrian, and in fact, he's the son of the Archduke Ferdinand. So his parents are killed on page 1, and that's why the war starts, of course. The Archduke and Sophie are killed. And so he spends the rest of the trilogy saying, like, this is all my fault.
Yeah.
My family tragedy is sort of... And the reason why I wanted to do it from his point of view is that my own mom died in 2003. And there is a thing where when you lose a parent, it's like the world is broken. You know, the world seems wrong, colors don't look right, everything's wrong for a while. And of course, when the son of the Archduke Ferdinand lost his parents, the world really did break. I mean, imagine losing both your parents, and then for the next 5 years, every newspaper article is about this horrible thing that happened because your parents died. You know, it's about some battle killing thousands of people. It's about, you know, a country being wiped off the face of the earth, a ship being sunk, and it's all because of your family tragedy. So there's a kind of, you know, and that's what it's like when you're a teenager.
Yeah, that's right. But this is it's painted very large on the entire world around him.
Yeah.
And the other main character of that book is Darren, the female lead, who pursues her own version of kind of self-actualization in the course of the story by pretending to be a boy for most of it.
Yeah, she wants to. Her dad was a balloonist and sort of raised her in a tomboyish way, and she wants to fly, and there's no opportunities for women. So she when she's 15, she dresses up as a boy and joins the British Air Navy, and winds up serving on the Leviathan, this sort of huge 1,000-foot-long airship. And the reason why I've always liked, you know, cross-dressing characters. I think that's really interesting. It always generates a lot of plot when characters have to keep a secret. Like, I never just have my characters sit down and tell each other, well, this is what happens, this is what's going on with me, what's going on with you. It's much better if they're keeping secrets from each other. Like, it's much better if Tally never tells anybody why she went to the smoke, because then you have this plot happening. And there was another reason I wanted to do it, which is I was reading this book. I was reading a lot of adventure stories for teenagers from like 1912 and 1913. And there was one called A Trip to Mars. And there was not a single female character in it. You know, when they go to Mars, these two boys go to Mars, and it's like...
So Mars wasn't inhabited with a race of four-breasted Amazonian women.
Yes. No, and there's a king of Mars, there's a prince of Mars, but there's no queen of Mars, there's no princess of Mars, there's nothing. And it was, I think back then, and this book, you know, it says on the back, Boys' Own Adventure. And they really thought that if, you know, boys were reading a book and they had a female character in it, that they would explode and throw the book into the fire, because how horrible would that be? And so, but there's this scene right at the beginning where Jack and Gerald are talking, and Gerald's looking up at the stars and saying, oh, you know, it's just so wonderful looking out at the universe. And Gerald is like, yeah, you're a queer chap, Jack. You know, you amuse me greatly when you go on. It's almost like you're a girl. And he actually says that. And that's the only place that the word girl appears in the whole book.
Wow.
And then he goes on to say, you know, when you're swoony like this, no one would imagine you're the same tough-fisted young Christian lad you other times turn out to be. Tough. I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's really hilarious. And of course, this is exactly the way teenage boys talk now. You know, if there's one 15-year-old's like, wow, the stars are pretty, man. The other one says, you know, dude, you're so gay. It's about policing masculinity. Yep. And so I wanted to kind of Darren to be the sort of two-fisted young buck in the book that gets mercilessly crushed on page 1 of A Trip to Mars.
Is it a particular? Some of your books do have characters that kind of cross boundaries and cross in your science fiction space opera series. There is an empire. There is a character or there's a relationship that could be a lesbian relationship, but may not be, because one of them is of very ambiguous gender and seems to be mostly machine. I forget her name.
Heard.
That's right. Is this a particular interest of you? Does it arise from... I mean, I alluded before to the fact that you are now mostly Australian, or we like to say you're mostly Australian. You spend a lot of time in Sydney, a lot of time in New York. You are kind of cross-cultural in some ways now. Is this sort of slippery notion of identity for your character something that you pursue consciously, or is it just sort of naturally arise out of your... Also from being a Texan boy who grew up in New York, spent a lot of time in New York.
Yeah, that's true too. I think my dad was a computer programmer back in the 60s, and back then when you got a big computer, which was as big as this tent, it came with guys in suits who made it do something. because I didn't just do anything out of the box. And so we lived in Houston for NASA. He worked for a place called Electric Boat that made submarines in Connecticut. He worked for Lockheed that made airplanes in California. So I moved around a lot. And so, I was forever, but I was from Texas. So people would say, in Texas, do you all ride horses all the time? And I would be like, yes, of course we do. So it sort of made me a bit of a liar and a storyteller.
Yep.
And aware that it's very easy to change your identity. You just have to say a few things and most people will believe you. It's shocking how people will just believe what you say when you tell them things. And I think, but I also think, as I said earlier, it makes good plot. Stories are more interesting when people are saying they're something and they turn out to be something else. When people are unsure of who they are. I mean, I think that's the plot of books for teenagers, is trying to figure out who you are. And also who you are in relationship to the world, and why did they make the world this way? Because the world is badly made. It has all kinds of weird things that everyone does and everyone thinks seem to be reasonable, like money. Like money's crazy, right? Like every couple of months you should realize that it's ridiculous that we all have agreed that this $100 bill is worth more than this $5 bill. And I think teenagers are a little bit more aware of that because we've sort of gotten, you're still questioning at that point in your life. So I like to have my characters still questioning stuff and making good stories and plot out of those questions.
And not saying what they're thinking. I think, certainly for me, when I was growing up as a teenager, I spent most of the time not saying anything that I really thought. So, and whether you're masquerading as a girl or whatever,
Right.
That's a big part of that. You live with another writer. You live with Justine Labalestia, who talked earlier and is sitting somewhere in the audience, I'm sure. I can't see, there she is. How's that influenced your writing? I mean, you throughout your career, you haven't always been with Justine. Is there a pre-Justine, a post-Justine Scott Labalestia? Were all your adult novels pre-Justine? What's the story? How's it like? We know you don't compete because Justine's... Oh, no, actually, Justine said earlier that you don't compete, but she said that she doesn't compete. Do you compete?
Yeah, actually, Justine and I are very competitive, but as she said, it's about things like who can spit the farthest. and we're just... Thumb wrestling is just not advisable at all. It just ends in tears.
I've seen you two in the last couple of days comparing the paces, the pace count on your Fitbits.
Right.
Who's got the most footsteps today?
Right, exactly. But as far as writing goes, the cool thing about living with another writer is that writing is a really solitary kind of profession. You spend a lot of time alone in a room, just looking at a screen, but it's nice to have somebody there, and it's nice to be able to say, so I've got a character who wants to go in the attic, and those things where you go, there's like a roof. In the roof, there's a thing, and you push it up. Is that an attic door? Is it a hatch or a door? Is it a hatch? And what happens if a ladder falls down? Is that a folding ladder, or is that like a what? And so you have those kinds of conversations about what are things called, and what are the names of the holes in your shoes for shoelaces, and the things that you forget. And it's nice to just have somebody there. And at the same time, the other thing we do is that we read to each other. Like we read our stories out loud, or whatever books we're working on, every 3 or 4 chapters. And it's really nice to have somebody who's in that world with you. And, because writing a book, it takes a year, and then after you turn it in, it takes another year before it gets published. And then, like a few weeks after that, people start reviewing it. And that's crazy, right? Like, imagine if you hit a 6, and then the crowd applauded 18 months later. Like no one would play cricket ever, right? Because you want more instantaneous feedback. So having someone in the room with you who you can try out a joke on, or you can read a chapter that night and see where they get bored and see where they're laughing. And of course, reading something out loud is something I suggest you do if you're, if you want to be a writer. Learn to read your stuff out loud, because even if it's to your dog, you can hear when the sentence is wrong if you can't read it out loud.
Particularly dialogue.
Oh yeah. Well, just everything.
Yeah.
Some sentences just weren't meant to be, and you can, and they look fine on the page, and you read them out loud, and you're like, oh, this is impossible.
Yes.
And then and you get groans, and you get laughter, and you get response, and human response is really important to us all.
So is Justine your first reader, or are you your first reader, or are you thinking of the audience when you're writing the book, or?
Yeah, I mean, my real audience is like teenage me, like my imaginary. It's the stuff I wanted to do. The stuff that I thought was wrong with, not just with books, but with TV and with movie. All this sort of, I had a list of all the things that were wrong, and I think that's watching bad TV. I think a lot of stuff comes out of that. or watching, reading things that are about. I mean, I think that's what. To go back to Buffy, that's what Buffy is about. It's the girl who just screams and doesn't help in the fight, and that just annoyed the crap out of all of us back then when every scene was written that way. So it was nice to have her help. In fact, be awesome.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think everybody, reading things that you love, but you can see that there's problems with, is a great source of inspiration for your own writing.
Writers are often asked what their influences are, and I don't know about you. I'll ask you in a second. But I always try to think of the good books that people will be impressed to hear influenced by.
Right.
But I was asked this question just the other day, and I decided to be honest. And I said, well, the biggest influence on me was a Doctor Who novel I read when I was like 8, and it's not a very good book, but it really had a huge influence on me. And watching bad things as well. I can do better than this. I can do better than this. But so not just bad TV, but what influenced you as a young person, as an adult? What influences you now? Where do you go to seek? Because I think you writers you are what you read to a certain extent.
Yeah. The other thing that happened when I was writing Leviathan, because it was set in a kind of steampunky world, and I wanted to look at lots of pictures, not just from that era, but also of the way people dress up now when they're trying to look like they're from back then. And it was kind of interesting finding all the people who dress up in sort of Edwardian costumes, and because people are fascinated with that whole era. I think Clive Palmer is rebuilding the Titanic, and he's already got 40,000 people signed up for the first voyage, and there's only room for 2,000 of them. And
is someone rebuilding the iceberg? That's what I want to know.
No, and the icebergs are all gone, so you have to build one.
That's true.
But so I think it's not just about books inspiring you or movies. It's about the visual world itself, and people, the kinds of. I think cosplay, as it's called, people dressing up in costumes, is really interesting and really useful, because it tells you a lot about how people see themselves outside of the regular clothes that we're supposed to wear. And that's why I like going to conventions like in Comic-Con, where people dress up like superheroes or the weird versions of superheroes or fictional characters, and it's kind of interesting to see what skins people put on to see what people wear in Halloween costumes and fancy dress parties. I've always been really interested in how the secret life that reveals. I think that's really useful and inspiring.
Do you read any fan fiction that's set in your universe? Speaking of secret lives and fantasies.
Yeah. I like fan art. There's been a huge amount of fan art for Leviathan. Lots of people drawing the characters and drawing the machines and stuff. There's been some really interesting fan fiction. Some of it set 15 years before the books. So it stars Alec's parents, because they're like, oh, Alec's parents, they get shot by these anarchists on page 1. So what was it like when they met? And I love the idea that somewhere a 14-year-old has asked themselves that question, and said, this must exist, and if Scott's not going to write it, I'm going to write it and put it online so that all of us can know how the Archduke and Sophie met.
And of course, there'd be historical research they could draw on.
Yeah, they didn't do that.
Well, it's a shame. You could have taught them valuable skills for future academic life.
I do think that they are I do get a lot of tweets every day. It's like, oh man, just aced this World War I history test thanks to Leviathan. Because even though my history is wrong, I think, as long as you have something to start with, you're going to know what's going on, because you just say, oh, it's like that. It's like Leviathan, but this is what's different.
Yeah, without the giant floating whales and the big machines and the Kraken.
But otherwise it's day to day. It was an interesting thing. Keith and I realized, because we were changing big, huge things, we wanted to make the history of World War I be exactly the same. So every country enters on the same day. The assassination happens on the same day. They might be wearing a jetpack, but the buttons are exactly 1914 buttons. We wanted to combine the fantastical with the absolutely historically correct, because that's much more interesting than just going off, whatever.
That's right. And did you draw on language at the time as well? Were you using contemporary slang and?
Yeah. No, I found a great book of swearing from back then, and people said all kinds of great stuff.
Barking spiders?
Barking spiders was hilarious. What was it? What's the other? Blisters. I think blisters is the best swear ever. Because blisters are really annoying, right? and they could be anywhere in your body, and they're just really annoying, and it's like a great thing to yell when something's being annoying. Blisters.
I wanted to raise fan fiction because one of the things I particularly love about the Leviathan series is the little coda that you put up on the web where Keith drew a picture based on one last final chapter, which totally feels like a bit of slash fiction. Alex dresses up as a girl. It kind of turns the table, and it's this wonderful little piece. Have you ever considered that publishing as part of the book, or do you view it as in a later edition? Is it a separate thing in your mind? Is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, after the series was over, I wanted to do like a Christmas present or just a holiday present for my fans, and I said, look, I'm going to write one more chapter and get Keith to do an illustration for it. What do you want to see? And the overwhelming response was Alec wearing a dress, the male character dressed as a. And I said, well, you want to see Alec wearing a dress or Darren wearing a dress? Because she never dresses up as a girl. And so there was like some of this and some of that. And so I decided I set a thing at a party where he had lost a bet. And, so he was supposed to dress up as a girl. It was a fancy dress party. So he was supposed to dress up in a dress. And then she decided that she would dress up in a dress too, even though she's still passing as a boy. And so you got all this. There was lots of what they call fan service in it, in terms of people. These were the things that my fans wanted to see, and so I wrote a whole chapter, and it's it's online, and people. What I love about teenagers is they can be very literal minded, and they all immediately asked me, "Well, is this canonical or not? Is this canon? Did this really happen, or is this you writing fan fiction?" And
which is, I guess, what I'm wanting to find
well,
out.
That's the
on the
question
record
that
now.
you just asked. And I feel like I prefer to leave that to them to do the. And so sometimes you see fanfic now, and it's does not comply with Goliath bonus chapter. And but you see, so that's why I don't want to publish it, because once it's in print, then it's automatically canon.
That's right. Yeah, I was hoping we'd get sort of a spin-off series, a comedy of manners, where the gender roles are kind of reversed. But I suspect we're not going to get that. Let's talk about film.
I think the Japanese can do, like Miyake can do that.
That's right. Yeah.
Miyazaki.
He can do whatever he wants. Yeah. He could buy Leviathan and turn it into that story. It'd be fantastic. I'd certainly go see it. Speaking of film, I know there was a talk of a So Yesterday movie a while ago. Is that still alive, or is that...
No.
No, that's it. But how about Uglies? I know Uglies was picked up recently.
Yes, Uglies is being worked on by Lola. Lola is a special effects company, a visual effects company, and they specialize in facial transformation. So they did Benjamin Button, they did the last scenes of Harry Potter, where they make everybody in the Harry Potter universe look like 35-year-old English people who married the second person they kissed in high school. The schlubbification of those characters. So they do age changing and face changing. They made Captain America look really skinny before he becomes Captain America, when actually he's totally buff.
Did they do Tron as well?
They made Jeff Bridges young in Tron. And so they sort of have been working on Uglies and doing stuff, and fairly shortly, in a week or so, we're going to be releasing some of the first images of just what they've done. They've just not actors, but models that they have taken and changed from their ugly normal selves into a pretty self. And these aren't just like photoshopping a model to make her look prettier. It's like the neck is longer, the body is different. So it's a whole amazing kind of cool process. So I kind of like the idea that it was optioned by a visual effects company, and that they're starting from it as a visual thing, because that's what it's about.
Are you any involvement in this? Have you seen any test shots or?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And I tell them when they're wrong and stuff. And they showed me. It was great. I was in LA, and they took me to a room and showed me like 28 different hoverboards. And it was like, which of these hoverboards are good? And I was like, that one.
Did they work?
No, they were just pictures of hoverboards, unfortunately.
No, it's a shame. You had to go through this process with the manga as well, because of course the pretties are kind of like manga characters, and if your ugly characters look like manga characters in the manga, then what are your pretties going to look like? How do you turn it up even further? How did they get over that?
Well, that's why I wanted to do the Uglies in graphic novel form. I wanted to do it in a manga style, in a Japanese style. Because if you did it in a sort of Western realistic comic style, then it would be like when you draw the pretty person, there would be people who say, that person's not pretty. You know, it's like when you make a movie about a band. If you've got a book about a band, you can be like, they can be the rockinest band ever, and everyone can, you know, can think they're awesome because you wrote it like they're an awesome band. But once you make a movie, you have to go actually get real music.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some percentage of the people who read the book are like, but they suck.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with faces and with beauty. So I thought it would be cool with the comics to do it sort of this Japanese comic book style, because when someone's pretty, you can just like draw hearts around them. There are these visual, whatchamacallits.
It's like a language,
conventions,
isn't it?
it's a visual language for what someone who's beautiful looks like in a Japanese comic book. And so I like that being sort of divorced from reality and a little bit less realistic.
And it's kind of about the reaction that the person elicits in the people around them. So the love hearts and stuff is not...
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open out to you guys if you'd like to ask Scott anything. We have a microphone in the middle there, so if anybody would like to ask Scott something, perhaps stand up and approach the mic and start a queue. I still don't know whether Scott's a science fiction writer or not, and of course that's what is science fiction, you know. But I know you're really interested in science and space and stuff. I've been I was with Scott when we saw Sundogs in New York. I've watched the Rings of Saturn from your balcony in Sydney. We saw the total eclipse in Woomera. I know you're a space head. I know you like that kind of stuff. You've written one space opera series. Is there going to be another space opera series? Are there going to be more space stuff? You know, for me,
Space stuff,
rockets and things.
I like space. Like I said, my dad worked for NASA. That was cool. He wrote the. He was in charge of the system that monitored their heartbeats. So, you know, and monitoring someone's heartbeat from 180,000 miles away used to be really difficult. But that was kind of cool. So it was always a part of my sort of household, is these kind of conversations. So yeah, I assume so. I never quite. There is an Empire 2 books aren't really finished. And so I guess I'm saving them for my middle years to go back. Yeah. It's just that writing for teenagers has been really interesting and much more rewarding in terms of fan response and in terms of money. So it's hard to drag myself away.
Well, that's good, because I kind of look at your track record and I see you've kind of done vampires, you've kind of done dystopic fiction, you've kind of done historical adventures now, you've kind of done real world with So Yesterday, and I kind of wonder if you're sort of checking off the list and you'll never go back. But if you're willing to entertain the idea, then I'm happy with that. So.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, my books are kind of different from each other. But
which is good.
That's okay.
Well, we have someone with a question there. Would you?
Hi, I'm very interested in the book you have with the illustrations. Were you looking at having some sort of structure with those illustrations, like one picture per chapter, or did you just want something flowing where you might have 2 or 3 in a chapter or something like that? And did it make a big enough impact for you to want to really start doing that with more books?
Yeah, we decided to do it with one illustration per chapter, more or less. And there's a couple of chapters that have 2. There's some chapters with none. But basically, and we wound up with 50 illustrations per book, which is really, which means they're very frequent. It's like every 8 or 10 pages. And I mean, the interesting thing is that sometimes I would have to there would be a chapter of mostly people talking. I was like, what are we going to do for an illustration? So I have somebody in the middle of the chapter like react to suddenly and like pull out a sword and say, what do you mean? Don't lie, just to shock the other character to make him tell the truth. And then, of course, if you're just leafing through the book, you see that chapter like, oh, it's a sword fight, awesome. But it's really a chapter about people talking. So
with
it
swords.
Is, yeah, with an exciting moment in the middle. But it is kind of...
it's sort of a variation on the Chandler line, that when you don't know what to do, have somebody burst in the door with a gun. You know, if you're in the middle of a conversation, have someone pull out a sword. You know.
Exactly, yes.
This is going back a little further now. I was wondering about Peeps or Parasite Positive, depending on what country you're in. Because at the time, because you've published that, and then there was The Last Days, which is, companion novel, and that sort of wrapped up a lot of the major plot. But there was also, there's this entire world, and there are all these things that you sort of developed a bit in The Last Days, and then you also introduced new things like the musical element. And I was wondering, have you ever considered or been tempted to, even if you don't tell a new story, to sort of create some kind of material that explores the world?
Yeah, just to explain that there's my book Peeps or Parasite Positive is as it was called in the UK it's kind of a vampire book, but basically I was reading a lot about parasitology, and parasites are just really cool. Like there's these parasites called Toxoplasma gondii, which are kind of famous now. But basically, who here has cats? Who has ever lived with a cat? So you are infected with Toxoplasma gondii, and it lives in your brain, and your immune system normally just kicks its ass. And they thought it had no real effect on people. But the cool thing is that they did research on Toxoplasma positive and negative people, and it turns out that Toxoplasma positive women spend more money on clothes, and the men shave less and get into more fights. And all Toxoplasma infected people pay you back. When you loan them money, they don't pay you back as easily. Like you have to bug them. And of course, we all know that this is what cats would do if they were people. They wouldn't shave, they'd be late to work, get into fights, they wouldn't pay you back. And I thought, this is so cool, these parasites are so cool. They're kind of like vampires, and they kind of are like puppet masters. So I wrote a whole book based on that. And then I wanted to write a book about a band, because I was in all these bands as a teenager, and I thought it'd be really fun, but I just didn't have enough going for my book about a band. So I said, I'll just set it in the Peeps world. And it's about a band that's coming together the same summer that this sort of vampire zombie apocalypse is happening. And they just want to be the band to dance to when the world ends. And that meant I had to create another other set of cool things to happen to them. But the answer to your question is actually no. I have never thought of expanding that universe. I'd love for someone else to. It would be fun. Again, Miyazaki can have it, $5, but I do like those characters a lot, especially the ones in Last Days, the characters in the band, because like I said, I was in a lot of bands as a kid, and that argument of what you're going to call yourself that happens throughout the entire book was part of my life at the time. Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering, back to the topic of the lack of females that were around during the World War I boys' adventure literature. Right. What inspires you as a male author, obviously, to write such strong female leads? Like, for example, Darren pretty much wears the pants literally in the relationship between her and Alec, and also Tally, to a large extent, is in charge of her own life and destiny, if you will.
Right. I mean, I wanted... The thing about what happened with Darren and Alec. Alec is the son of the Archduke Ferdinand. Darren is the girl dressing as a boy. Alec spent a lot of time being depressed because his parents were just killed. And I realized, so if he's going to be like sad for the first half of at least half a book, that Darren has to be having a really good time to balance it out. So he became a much more contemplative, thoughtful character. His abilities are like he's been raised to, speak lots of languages and to know lots of diplomatic and history stuff. So he had all those skills. So she had to have the knot tying and, and sort of more ass-kicking kind of skills. And what I love is when they first meet and he thinks that she's a boy, he finds himself thinking that he is the boy that she is the boy that he would have liked to have been if he hadn't been raised such a prince. He's like a useless kind of prince, and he'd never been able to tie knots or get into fistfights or anything. So she becomes this sort of model boy for him because he's this awesome working class, sailor, sky sailor. And so I love that moment that you get with him realizing she's a girl and it's like, crap, now I really am the worst prince ever. But I mean, as far as why I did it, it is just structural. I thought, if he's going to be this way, then she has to be this way. I want that balance. And I had two older sisters, so it was easier for me to think of, who were capable and aggressive and all the kinds of things that older siblings are. I think women are really cool and awesome, and they should be written that way.
So you're not basing them on anybody in particular?
Not really. Tally. With Tally, I thought it made more sense to have a female character because it's a book about plastic surgery. And although lookism and worrying about your look and your body affects both boys and girls, it probably affects girls a lot more. So I thought it made sense to be a female character. So most of my decisions come out of a structural idea. Also, I think it's probably easier to write female teenage characters because a lot of teenage boys don't really know what they're thinking. Well, the teenage girls have figured it out a bit more, a bit earlier, because they talk about it a lot. Yes?
Hi, I'm a huge fan of Leviathan, and I actually listened to it as an audiobook. And if people haven't listened to the audiobook, it's narrated by Alan Cummings, and he's absolutely fantastic. And when he does blisters, it's like a huge laugh line every single time. He goes, blisters! He's got this fantastic accent for doing blisters. But I wanted to ask a bit of a geeky question that pivoted off something you were saying earlier. Yeah, you talked. There's a Ray Bradbury story, The Sound of Thunder, where he goes back in time and he changes one little thing in the past, and everything changes. Did you feel a little bit queasy about changing the whole scientific history of the 19th century, but still having World War I start on June 28th, 1914, and Franz Ferdinand marrying Sophie and all that jazz? Or you just didn't care about it because, hey, it's a YA?
Yeah, not because it's YA. But because, I mean, yes, I agree that it's completely bogus that, if Charles Darwin discovers, and there's walking tanks, you change everything else. It is ridiculous that Sophie and Ferdinand get shot on the same day. But it's not an alternate history novel. Yeah. What it was is, I mean, I also had a reviewer in the New York Times say, "Oh, it's silly that they use these olden day swears. Why don't they just swear normal? Kids, we know that kids like swears." It's like, just look at my other books. I do have teenagers say other words other than blisters and barking spiders. I didn't do that because I was afraid of swearing. I didn't do that because because I thought history would work that way. What I was doing was creating a kind of dialogue between these older books for teenagers and newer books for teenagers. And it wouldn't have made sense to me to, and like I said, I wanted the history of the war to be the same, so you had something to attach it to. And so it felt like something historical and real, as well as being something fantastical and strange. And to me, that's what's cool about steampunky kinds of things, is that you're blending of really assiduously researched history with something stranger and fantastical. That's where the pleasure comes from. I mean, it's one thing to have a scientist with an electric, a cool electric gun. It's much better if it's Tesla. It's one thing to have, I could just go out, they meet Pancho Villa, they meet lots of, this. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that having that real history in there gives you a ping. That it's the mental response in the reader that I'm going for, and that's what I think is interesting about alternate history. That's what's interesting about steampunk and about playing with history.
Stephen Donaldson, I think, once said that speculative fiction arises from the sort of the collision between the everyday, the normal, and the accepted, and the unusual and the strange and the unexpected. And in that sense, the World War history, the known history of World War I plays the normal role, but the clankers and the giant mutated beasts.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I think it's possible that a reason why I wanted to write something in 1914 does have to do with the fact I live in Australia now. Because in America, we don't really think very much about World War I. It's just this kind of, it's like World War II, but there's no Nazis. There's like, why would you want to do that? And we don't, we only got involved in 1917. It wasn't, they didn't have the incredible demographic effects of wiping out such huge percentage of the male population between the age of 17 and whatever. And so it wasn't, so World War II is the big war there, because that's the war where America became a superpower. Whereas World War I is the big war here, because that's the war where where your relationship with Britain changed because of Gallipoli, and it's the first war where you're on your own country. It's all these kinds of really interesting things. So I think becoming aware of that period of history and more into that period of history is part of coming to Australia. And so World War I seemed like a more kind of normal thing to write about, and a kind of a part of the history in a way it doesn't seem like it is at all in America.
Being a writer is kind of like, it's kind of like being a crazy person masquerading in a world, a sane world. We don't have normal jobs. We don't kind of fit in the usual social mores. And one of the things I like about your books, particularly one series we haven't mentioned, which is the Midnighters series, is that everybody on that book is kind of slightly crazy, and the craziness is kind of owned and developed and embraced, and the characters aren't normalised at the end of the books, and that never happens in your books. People aren't normalised; their craziness is kind of owned, and I really like that. And is this the way you feel about the world? Do you feel like a crazy person who is masquerading?
Yeah, and I've never thought about that. I wrote Midnighters. Midnighters is set in a small town in Oklahoma, and there's 25 hours in the day, but one of them's rolled up tight, and you don't really see it unless you were born at midnight. So these 5 kids who were born on the stroke of midnight, and everybody else freezes in that town, and they get to walk around and do stuff. There are also these creatures called darklings, which are kind of scary, that only live in that hour, that have been pushed in that hour by humanity. So there's this kind of, and the reason why I wanted to write that is that, and then the kids who were born at midnight are basically goths. And I wrote it after Columbine, after the Columbine massacre, when everybody in the United States said, goths are evil, and they shoot someone, and it clearly has to do with the music they listen to, not with any other possible thing we could possibly figure out that has to, that this massive gun killing spree, that caused this. So I wanted to write something where goths were heroes, and where they're sort of like, irascible take on their school and on everything going on around them. It didn't come out of insanity, but really came because they had this secret knowledge that no one else had. And so that's why I wanted them to be like the heroes of the book.
Good. It seems like a perfect pitch for a TV show. The books.
It started out that way.
Did it really?
Yeah. A friend of mine from high school called and said, I remember you from high school and you were pretty smart, and I need a pitch for a paranormal TV show in like 5 minutes. Can you do it? And I was like, yes. And it went for like the next year. It went up, and then it was like Chris Carter versus me, and he won.
Oh, that's a shame.
And they gave the idea back to me, and I wrote a trilogy. Hello.
Hi. It's sort of like in regards to the Uglies trilogy. I was just wondering what made you decide to go the extra mental step with the surgery. Like, you could have just done the beauty, but you chose to make it so the authorities in that city were actually messing with their heads, sort of like a restriction on not only their personal agency, but their creativity, their empathy, their long-term attention span, like all of that changed. Is that in any way tied to the things about body image? It could have been technically one or the other. What was your thinking behind that?
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that you find out in Uglies is the operation doesn't just change the way you look, it does, in fact, change the way you think. And so this method of social control, which is making people look alike, is also making people think differently. And pretties are a little bit less aggressive, and they have a little bit less attention span. They're a little bit easier to control, basically. And I just, and partly that's like a fairly obvious, heavy-handed kind of thing. Like if you believe someone's opinions are more valuable because they're better looking, then that's not a very smart thing to believe. And if you start obeying people because they're attractive or charismatic, then you tend to do stupider things than people who listen harder and judge ideas on their own merit rather than based on how pretty someone is. And so I wanted to say that this is part of a piece. This is all part of a way of understanding the world. Do you just look at the surface of things, or do you look underneath the surface? And governments do this. They don't just change the way we look, and societies do this. We don't just say you have to wear a shirt, but you're allowed to think anything you want. It's you have to wear a shirt and pants everywhere, apparently, and you have to think a certain way, and we all talk a certain way, and we're all compelled to think certain things are really important crises, and and like in Australia. I pick up the paper every day, and it's like, the economy, all this, all this stuff. And it's like, you have 4.9% unemployment and huge growth, and everything's awesome, and an incredibly microscopic budget deficit, and it's a crisis.
Yeah. Because
it's the crisis that you've got. And it's, if Obama had those numbers, he would be reelected president for life right now. And but Julia Gillard's imperiled because it's a crisis. And all these things are, all of these things are fed into our brain in a certain way and become part of the dialogue, and they are like surgery. Your brains are being operated on at all times by the people who tell you things, including me.
And you sort of like to blur the line between what's surgery and what people are actually doing for themselves mentally. Like you've got Tally, who's had the lesions, as you like to call it, on her brain to make her think a certain way, but she can think her way out of it as well. It's sort of like,
Right.
I thought that was interesting how you can, on the one term it's like, oh, these people have been brainwashed, but on the other hand, if they're like, even if they're dumb and shallow and silly as are pretty, some of them still have the sheer mental capacity to think their way out of it. Like, it's an interesting balance between what's been medically induced on them and what they actually have as part of their own character.
Yeah, because I think people do think their way out of the kind of brainwashing that they get afflicted with, and we do all have the ability to rewire our own brains. You know, other people can change the way we think, but we can change the way we think ourselves too. I mean, that's the fairly obvious message I'm going for in that book.
This is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by the Uglies series. Like, is it a dystopia? Because on the one hand, it is. You know, kids are cut up to look the same and think the same, but on the other hand, there's cool stuff as well. I mean, the specials are great. They're kind of the superheroes of this universe, but they're also really scary. But some people would totally want to be specials given the chance. And Extras, the extra book in the trilogy, is full of really cool stuff that if you looked at it a different way, it would be terrifying. And I think the Ugly series is quite an achievement in that regard.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. People, the society that people live in Uglies is actually quite. You know, they've gotten rid of a lot of problems. They're very good. They have solar power and all kinds of stuff. They're not destroying the world. So they have a lot of stuff going well, and they're good at lots of things, but they do have a control problem. And I'm not trying to make a point that, you know, environmentalists are horrible controlling, but I'm just saying, you know, every solution. You know, our problem in the old days used to be that people lived very far apart, and there was, you know, very small towns where people were very isolated, and we solved that problem with cars. And now cars are the problem because they're destroying the planet, destroying the, you know, means we have to dig. You know, it means we have to pay lots of money to people in the Middle East who don't necessarily like us or our way of life. You know, there's all this, however you solve problems, this generation, my generation solves problems, it will leave a different set of problems for the next generation. And I think that's part of what's going on in Uglies, is that the heavy-handedness of the response to our problems becomes another set of problems that they have to rewire their brains to think their way out of again. And I think that's the way generations work. And I think that's a thing that teenagers are very aware of, is the fact that they can look at the adults and say, why are you that way? Why are you adults that way? That's the experience of every set of teenagers that comes along, is to critique their parents.